Welcome, everybody, to the 12 property days of Christmas. And I am absolutely delighted that we have the phenomenal Adam Lawrence. Now, for those of you who don't know Adam Lawrence, he is one of the founder members of PIP, Partners in Property. He's an extensive property investor with a very small portfolio and a lot of property experience, to the point where he almost bought a property that wasn't a property from a seller recently. And I'll let him share that story with you and one of the partners in property meetings. Now, Adam, we've known each other a while. We've sparred on some of our other videos just up here where we've argued for flipping versus keeping, commercial versus residential. And I've had a lot of fun with you over the last year during lockdown. But our audience out there would love to know what you see 2021 looking like, whether you see it as an optimistic, positive year, where the opportunities will come from, or are you seeing doom and gloom and the chicken licking, the skies falling in? Adam, what's your take on 2021?
Thanks, Andrew. I think it'll be, dead easy, really, won't it? Should be a pretty standard year. I mean, not like there's anything going on at the moment, really. So, no, that'll have to go in the outtakes as well. No, I think
plain sailing. I think, Adam, plain sailing is what I'm looking at.
I think it'll be challenging. I think the can's been kicked down the road a few times this year, and I've discussed some of that with David some months ago. And I think there'll probably be a continuation of that can being kicked down the road until there's any sort of major shift in the credit rating of the UK or anything else similar, because there's a lot of us have got that feeling that, the taxation, they're going to ring the bell, they're going to start getting the monies in. But of course, esteemed economists like ourselves understand that to start ramping up taxation at this point when the economy is so fragile is actually the opposite of what you want to do, really. And as unpopular as it would be, you're better off cutting tax. Now, they haven't had much pushback to cutting the VAT in the leisure and hospitality sector, even though it's very expensive. And it's strange when you think about it, how few headlines there are about that. Basically none, despite the cost of it. Whereas the headlines about the furlough scheme, for example, are thick and fast, even though a lot of people who were furloughed would otherwise have been made redundant, and there would have been a similar amount of benefits being claimed. So it's a funny thing that we all pick up on, isn't it? So, I mean, on the tax perspective, obviously we've had the news overnight that Wales decided to implement a surprise extra 1% hike, bringing them in line with Scotland. So one of the questions for next year on the investor's mind will have to be, is England going to go the same way? Will we feel the 4% additional? Obviously painful if we do. That would be a 33% increase on what we're already paying. Obviously going to increase the attractiveness of properties under 40k, if you're lucky enough to buy them and you buy in those areas where you can still get them. I don't know that we will go in that direction, because obviously the government doesn't necessarily lean the same way in England as it does in Wales and Scotland. But capital gains is obviously going to be on people's minds. And what will that do? As we go into the first quarter, we're obviously looking at, the government have said this week, that they're definitely not extending the stamp duty holiday. And I know that the three of us would all agree the government always do everything they say, and they never do anything that they don't say. So we know that's for sure, until they change their mind.
Well, I think that's linked to the fact that they actually released a press release erroneously early, which then would have killed the market. So I think this time they've said, oh, we're not doing it, just because they don't want to cause another cliff edge moment.
Yeah. And I think we'll see. The thing is, as well as I do, and you know what it will be like for the conveyancers in March. I mean, it's going to be a bloodbath, isn't it? And people need to be getting their transactions through ASAP. And there'll be people who, Boxing Day, as we all know, it's the #1 internet day of the year. Everybody's looking on Rightmove. Lots of enterprising agents do a special Boxing Day release and all the rest of it. And quite a lot normally hits Rightmove while everyone's browsing. Now, 60 to 70% of those transactions that get agreed in the last week of December or the first week of January, you and I well know, will not complete by the end of Q1. Now, people are over optimistic as a rule. That is one of their behavioural biases as a human being, and they won't realise that, and they'll think, right, it's right, we can go out shopping, we'll get this through before the stamp deadline. If you introduce a chain of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 properties, you can absolutely forget about it. There might be some interesting exchanges of contracts going on the 31st of March, and people taking a few risks, I dare say, as well. So I think we know that, we'll know by early February where reality will have been that unless you're buying through auction, you're not settling by the 31st of March, or you're a cash buyer, of course. I'm going to leave the investors and the cash buyers out of that, because we're talking about the broader market here. So we'll see how quiet February is for transactions. And it's been an interesting year to watch. I mean, we've all had to pass through the data of this is up 71% this month. And it's like, well, it is, but last month there was a lockdown. So what, really? It's hard enough to analyse things anyway with all the noise there is out there, all these clickbait headlines, let alone when you start looking at, markets that have been effectively closed or markets that have been significantly suppressed in different times. And I think it's incredible and testament to the UK appetite for property, and also the people who have been motivated by the lockdown to go and find a change in their life, a change in their property, because they don't want to be locked down in that property anymore. There's been this, interest in the seaside, interest in the rural towns, interest in second homes, because let's not forget our friend Corbyn a couple of years ago was looking like a potentially likely candidate to get into number 10, and was talking about second homes taxes. And if you remember, the second homes market took a real dive at the time. So that's a long forgotten memory. And actually now people are again looking at these rural and semi-rural places, especially if there's half decent Wi-Fi, because they can go and work from there Thursday, Friday maybe, and have the weekend there and things like that. So that's a little bit of how the other half live. But that second homes market is probably as buoyant, especially given a pandemic, is about as buoyant as it's been for years and years. And I think that will continue into 2021. And I think we'll see where the city centre leverage is at, really, won't we? Because city centres are, I don't know if you've strolled through anywhere. I've not been into London for 9 months myself, but I've been into Birmingham for a couple of meetings, and totally different place. Very, 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 very quiet. You get a private train these days. Who knew? You get a train that takes you on your own because no one else is on it. And of course, the government must be hemorrhaging money operating all the rail services at the moment, only to give them away again when they look like they might make a profit again when things go back to anywhere near normal. But I expect city centre prices to, the market's normally more robust and it can ride out a bit of pain. But if you think about what we've got on the go, we've got cladding issues, not even buildings that have necessarily got cladding issues, but they haven't got the paperwork that says they haven't got cladding issues. And as such, that causes lenders to be very concerned. And that's a big, big problem, as you know, and that's not really washed out anywhere near yet. COVID has pushed back the chat that we had around leasehold in general, and leasehold was really hitting the headlines with, all these unfair service charges and ground rents are too high. But all this is still going on, and we're seeing an increased number of flats come through our funnels, and ultimately some of them you really can't transact upon at the moment. You're seeing stuff for sale you haven't seen for a long time. People trying to sell lifetime tenancies just to release capital. So people are hungry to release assets. I've seen stuff in auction recently where first time to market for 50 years, and things that would have been legacy assets for family investment companies and things are being cashed in on, or not. Some of them are not selling, even though they look to be selling at very reasonable yields. So the old be greedy when others are fearful seems to spring to mind, the great words of Uncle Warren. There's definitely some of that going on.
It's an interesting point you make. I've observed very, very similar with assets that have not been to market for a very long time, and the statement that people seem to be cashing in their assets. Now, given the quantitative easing that's been going on, and you know and I know, because we follow the macroeconomics of these things, when we're adding money into the economy, and if we're adding at a disproportionate rate to other economies, our exchange rates go down, which basically makes imports more expensive on the top of already situations that might make imports more expensive. But it also devalues the pound in terms of it's a hidden inflation on your pound. So to sell an asset,
The pound in your pocket will still be the same, Andrew. The pound in your pocket
it'll still be round and it'll still be golden
yeah.
coloured, but it will buy you less. And that's my point. So to be selling a scarce asset, such as property, albeit that it is an illiquid asset, indicates to me that the organizations selling them or families selling them need the cash because they've hit the buffers after 9 months, perhaps bankrolling stuff, and they've not been able to evict tenants or get stuff in the pipeline. So, I mean, where do you agree, disagree? Where do you think that takes the market?
I think that's a really astute observation. I think that's definitely part of the story. But there are buyers for this stuff as well. So there's cash in the market to buy this stuff. Absolutely. And I agree with you in as much as a suppressed interest rate, and we've pretty much guaranteed a suppressed interest rate for the next few years. The bank has said as much, really. And the fragility will be so high as that it will be impossible to put it up anyway. Even if inflation does start ravaging away, they'll have to find other ways of pulling other levers to control it realistically. Well, one would think that assets that yield would become more and more attractive because the risk-free rate is down to basically zero. And, economics teaches us that effectively we would expect suppressed returns, although the risk premia have gone up. And I wonder if some of this cashing in is due to, I think there's people who are at a certain stage of their life who were happy going along, accumulated assets, taking risks, and suddenly this year happens. And you go, do I really want to take that much risk anymore? Or is it time to say, do you know what? A little bit earlier than I planned, put the feet up, sell the stuff at a bit less than I thought I was going to get for them, and enjoy the rest of my time on the earth. When we've been encouraged this year to face our mortality like we've never done before, whatever age we are, my children have been talking about the virus and it makes them think about their own. It's a sobering thought, so it does put things into context for people. Now, I think the smart people are the buyers, Andrew, in this given economically, I can't see how the buyers aren't the smart people, not the ones who are overpaying, but the ones who are picking up these sort of legacy looking assets that are yielding with pretty strong income streams that look like they're going to be robust. I mean, it'd be a hell of a year to have been going around buying supermarkets or industrial units that you lease to Amazon or Next or people like that, wouldn't it? That's the thing.
There's enough shopping centres coming up as well. And the problem with the shopping centres, as you and I know, a lot of them have national chains in, and the national chains have been sort of going, oh, I might pull a CVA and try and renegotiate my lease. But if you approach those malls in a different way, those shopping malls can actually be high yielding and higher yielding than they are now. And there's been quite a few come through auction and quite a few come to the market. But, this is about you and your 2021, not me. So carry on, Adam.
So yeah, that'll take us into an interesting first quarter. And what you mentioned, Andrew, as well about the devaluation of the pound. I mean, obviously, there's a suggestion reading a little bit below the headlines that actually we're quite good at analysing the genomic sequencing in this country. And it's very possible this terrible extra variant is already out at all of these countries. But perhaps it's the Brexit thing. Perhaps it's the timing just to say, well, we just shut the doors 10 days early on our old mates. That's there's a little bit of sting in the tail of that, isn't there, really, as well? But I strongly suspect this variant will be. There's no way they're going to contain it to England or whatever. So I strongly suspect it's already out there, and there's whispers that it came from South Africa in the first place anyway. So it'll have gone via a number of other destinations, won't it? And that depreciation that looks, you know, potentially quite likely next year, that goes alongside the extra foreign investors 2% levy that's coming in on. Like, we need something else to happen on the 31st of March, because it's not like it's an eventful day at the moment. You know, we're also getting this extra 2% levy. So if things depreciate by 3 or 4%, then that will make up for it for the foreign investors, who I think are still piling into the UK. I know of a few people who are dealing with significant sums from Hong Kong, and of course Hong Kong's had its own challenges this year that's brought it maybe closer to its alma mater, if you will, and probably the UK is a more attractive investment destination for those in Hong Kong with either dual citizenship or UK passports, or an invitation to come and reside, apart from anything else. So that's interesting. And will we see a mini boom in there? If you're overseas and at the moment you can benefit from a 3% stamp duty or a 15k stamp duty holiday on 500k, and it's another 2% back on top of that, there's another 10k to be saved there. There might be a few decent sized London flats and things transacting on the 29th, 30th and 31st of March, I dare say. So that's going to give us what we always, and it's always the same, isn't it, in these situations? The most recent example being 2016, and that was really only us mere investors who were getting hit with this 3% additional stamp duty charge. The market just absolutely took off. The pricing went ridiculous. Prices were being struck on in March, and then in April it fell off a cliff completely. And in May, I was picking stuff up. In May 16, I was picking stuff up 7 to 10% cheaper than I would have paid 6 months before, but I was paying the 3% tax. So obviously that.
Not for no reason that they have this science called behavioural economics, and the way in which people react is kind of way over the actual fundamentals that sort of underpin everything. And coming back to the point you made earlier, that was it 2014 or whatever, when we were all being encouraged to cash in our pensions and pile those into property. Then along comes this Section 24 and everything, and they nabbed us. And now along comes a completely different set of circumstances again, which again may cause all these guys to actually sell up what they bought.
Yeah. And of course, you know, I think one of the things that the Chancellor, I mean, we've obviously seen while we're talking tax-wise as well, the capital gains speculation that's been going on. It does feel like quite a good time to sell. If there's one more straw you want to put on the camel's back, it'd probably be doubling the CGT, wouldn't it? If that is what's going to happen.
And not rebasing it upon somebody deceasing.
Yeah. So crystallisation, I mean, there really is cake and eat it stuff there for the revenue, isn't there? You know.
Well, it's an easy target. It's an easy target.
Will we be the first country in the world to have a capital gains tax and a wealth tax? I mean, that would be pretty brutal if we were. You'd think wealth tax would make more friends in terms of the voting populace, but it doesn't normally work like that, because if you haven't got it yet, you're usually aspirational, especially if you're politically active. So it may work, it may not, but that would obviously force a few. If there was a leak on that basis, there might be a few. If you're holding on to a few, 500k assets in the southeast, and you hear there's a CGT hike and they're in your own name, it makes an awful lot of sense to get rid of them, doesn't it? If there really is a prospect of things doubling. So
there are other ways other than selling, though, aren't there, Adam? I mean, we're slightly more educated, and as you know, we did a video here with Mark Smith about the Section 24 and the capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and how to mitigate tax in a very, very legal way. So, I mean, if you're educated, you can mitigate against those liabilities.
And I don't dispute that at all, Andrew, but I would say if you haven't done anything about Section 24 by now, I'd be surprised if you're getting off your backside to do much 4 3/4 years in, or wherever. Yeah. Well, no, 5.5 years in, aren't we? June 2015. So, it seems that the educated will have done their tax planning by now, I would have thought, largely speaking. So it's more likely the uneducated panicking. There'll be people who I know a few people who've got investors signed onto sort of multiple striated lease options that vest every year, that are now those investors, the people selling up are probably thinking, well, hold on, I'm being pushed into 2023 where I did, because we might not have a CGT allowance. That may well evaporate, you know, and if it does, it creates other, but this is always the nature of tweaking the tax system, which is obviously their favourite plaything. I think it's more political than economic, as we were saying, because, you know, the economy doesn't need further suppression at this point. It needs invigoration. And Boris is a big booster. He loves to boost things. He loves to talk things up. He can't talk things up while his chancellor is, you know, whacking tax rates up on you. So while I think it's probably a once in a generation or several generations chance of increasing national insurance with the support of the population, probably for once, I'm not sure it'll happen, because I don't think they want to see the suppression effect on the economy. And we need to get things rolling. I don't know what the figures are going to look like for Q4, but it's going to be another wavy one because of lockdowns. I did expect the markets to be a bit more perturbed yesterday than they were, I must say. I thought it would be a bloodbath yesterday. But I think while the taps are on and the QE that you referred to already is there, and, you know, the US have announced another, well, they're trying to get another 900 billion stimulus through, aren't they? That's going to be going through the houses in the new year, and probably has got support of both sides. So something will, even if it's only $500 billion or whatever they throw at it, you know, there's plenty more coming down the pipe, and our equivalent there, that gives us another justification for another 7,500 billion spend, doesn't it, to do something with.
Well, it keeps our exchange rate in parity with them.
Well, this is exactly what you referred to, isn't it? So it opens the door for us to nearly mirror that monetary stimulus side of things. And
we've also got companies as well who are trying to stimulate us to spend money. I mean, just before we jumped on this interview, I was reading my emails and I had one from British Airways announcing a sale. I thought the irony of it, in that I can't even catch a plane to another country because nobody's letting us in on today's date. There's obviously some good flight tickets available.
Yeah, first class. You can't leave the runway. That is the catch. Got to stay on the tarmac. But never mind. But that's just really, you know, a little snippet of Q1, really, isn't it? And what will happen there. And I think that says to you how volatile the year will be. I mean, going back to your point about the number of commercial assets that have been up for sale, the thing is, a lot of them have transacted, haven't they, Andrew? So obviously, to do that, there has to be a buyer and a seller. And so it's not like we're seeing a one-way scenario. We did see a bit of a one-way in the auction market, specifically for Resi, where there just wasn't enough stock because the gates had stopped things coming to market. But the buyers were still super keen, especially with the bounce back money in their pockets. They were as keen as they've ever been, weren't they? They were as keen as they've ever been.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting one, the auctions and commercials, because you've got the market polarized into two bits. One where people are selling off, as you say, to exit, and the buyers are looking to potentially add value to those. You've then got yielding stocks that there's nothing to add value to. For argument's sake, the shopping centres, and they've been selling off on 40, 50% yields, which is phenomenal for that type of asset class, but it's linked to the risk of CVAs with their tenant demographic. But when you actually look underneath why those are being sold off, it's down to the fact that because of the CVAs and the forecasts and predictions on those businesses going south, the banks revalued their portfolios, revalued the assets and said, now you're outside covenant, chuck some cash in, and in an illiquid type business, there wasn't the cash to put in, so they've had to sell off.
What a time to be rattling the jar, well into a pandemic. I mean, it makes sense, and that's where people who are cash rich have still been, as there always is in these situations. And this really speaks to next year, doesn't it, guys? Because opportunity will continue. I wouldn't say fortune favours the brave. I'd say you want to be using sensible leverage because it's cheap. Don't want to be overextending yourself. But we all know people are going to want to go back out to experiences. So if it's rather than sort of retail, and I think some of these malls, I know it's already happening down in London, but some of these are going to, you know, morph into, there'll be a few more restaurants there, there'll be a few more, it's going to be a more holistic experience, let's say. People are mad for going back out to leisure activities. They can't because they're closed, you know, but I think people are going to have more resolve than they had next year when this finally blows over. And whether that's, obviously the government seems to think that's going to be May time at the moment. I think there's still a hope that it could be sooner than that, because we've kicked things out further. We underreacted, and this government has underreacted at least half a dozen times that we could all point to in big U-turns. But to an extent, there will be a point, I think, where they've overreacted, and then there'll be a couple of months of really strong economic activity that will put a lot of confidence back in the marketplace. Now, of course, a lot of people may not have been able to keep their businesses open for that to happen, and that's very sad. But that also means friction. It means assets changing hands. It means opportunity for those who put themselves in those positions. So I think it will be volatile, and I think it will be those who are skilled and those who are heavy on cash that will do very well. But I think if you carry on following good fundamentals and don't overextend yourself, I see no reason not to be transacting with optimism in 2021, because I don't know what those shopping centres were valued at pre-covenant activation, but I don't know what they were valued at in 19. And of course, we know Into is the big example. Their share price has been hammered for years, and then this year it was just a bridge too far. But, you know, this is the time to, is the high street over? Is retail dead? Do people not want to go? No, there's probably inside some of those shopping centres, there'll be some good solid covenants that are great businesses. If you've got discount retailers, for example, would you want to be involved in a discount retailer? I would. Pretty recession-proof, makes money. You know, it's a cracking business model. So just because it's in a shopping centre doesn't make it a bad asset. And that's where those who get right under the bonnet of the leases and the covenant, and also probably, Andrew, have the intestinal fortitude to disagree with some of the prevailing opinions, because some of the doomsday predictions are just not necessarily going to be correct. I mean, we've got to see next year something happen on business rates again, whether that's sector specific, we don't, but I can't imagine that we could see a budget on the 2nd of March that didn't include something for leisure and hospitality on the rate side of things. Obviously, the world is pushing for more and more grants at the moment, and they want more and more grants to be happening. I think there's a bit of a pushback against that from this government, but something's needed. And if you're going to suddenly over one weekend come up with a tier 4, who knows if there's a tier 5? And if you're supporting businesses in tier 2 and 3, presumably you've got to do a bit more in tier 4. And so there is, you know, what did we borrow last month? 31, 32 billion, something like that. Biggest borrowing month in the history of the UK. It's sort of skated across the headlines, but it hasn't really, you know, motivated anyone to speak out about it. There's 34 pretty good reasons to talk about it, you would think.
We've seen a tiny little virus like that, so even smaller than that, create an impact on a scale of a world war or something. It's going to take 20, 30 years to sort of pay it all off to get the deficit down on this kind of thing. And one of the problems that the markets have had, and politicians in particular, is understanding the science. I mean, at the time of recording this, we hear about this variant in the virus. We've had all these countries shutting off the UK and all this kind of thing. But all there is in the science, and I'm not talking about the tabloids, there's one little article in the BMJ which doesn't say anything about it being more infectious and merely refers to a comment by a minister. And that's all it says. So, you know, we might be overreacting. And thinking back to last, like April or something, the markets were factoring in COVID being over by August. So kind of, there's a big disconnect. And in fact, to vaccinate the world might take until 2023. And so, you know, there are some big question marks, aren't there, Adam?
Oh, there are. But I think we also need to remember that when The other thing that's probably difficult for people to hear, and this doesn't necessarily just pertain to property, but if we look back at the Spanish flu, which obviously has been looked at in detail since the pandemic was upon us back in March, and we look at the World War, as you just mentioned, David, which was, I wouldn't be surprised if this was similar, 50, 75 years to pay it off. I wouldn't. They've already used the term war debt. They've already sowed those seeds, so that's already in the mind. So we might be paying this off in 2100. Wouldn't be unthinkable. I personally don't believe it'll ever be paid off because we're a deficit country, and that's all part of the game, isn't it? And we know that. So
I was going to actually interject and say that exact same thing, because in my personal opinion, there will be political noise about we need to pay down the debt levels, and that's similar to everybody around the world starts paying down a little bit. We've got to keep in tune. If we don't keep in tune, it affects, again, exchange rates, interest rates. The arbitrage goes out of balance and it has to rebalance itself. But actually, we've written this money, we've depreciated our pound effectively. And isn't that exactly what a government wants to do? And to keep the money in the economy, because as soon as you start taking it out of the economy, it's coming out of our pockets and therefore contracting the spend and therefore causing a spiral downwards. So my personal opinion is it will stay, albeit we might mess around the edges, but it will stay.
You've got this perverse difference, haven't you? Because Boris is a big state kind of guy, as long as it's got Boris's name all over it. Total opposite to Thatcher, really. Not really spoken about that much, the diametric opposition, really, between the two of them. But her very much a monetarist, him very much a Keynesian, really, or a Keynesian with reservation, anyway. And of course, Donald Trump, very much a Keynesian. Again, not often mentioned very much, probably because people think John Maynard Keynes is much more sensible than Donald Trump. I don't know, but yeah, it's very good point. And I think that the point I was going to make around the Spanish flu and the World War and the Great War and World War II was what happened every single time afterwards in the years close to those events. A huge economic boom for those reasons that you say, Andrew. And this is much more of a, yes, it's cleared out some companies who had fragile business models. Yes, it's cleared out some legacy assets that were maybe over leveraged or had unfavourable loans against them and things like that. It's definitely done some of that. But really, once that, as David said, that smaller than tiny little microbe is largely dealt with, and let's face it, if our population over 65 was vaccinated, I would probably make an argument that we probably are, nearly back to business as usual. It may not work out like that because we've gone so over the top, really, in the way we've reacted to it. But we now know things we didn't know in March and April, and one of those is age is by far the largest predictor of death. And, average age of death, 82.7? I mean, I'm not trivializing it. It's a lot of people. It's very, very sad. But when you look at those facts and you think, well, about the economic damage and then the resultant mental health damage and the resultant extra stress and all the rest of that, there is a health versus health argument that needs to be, voiced, and we really should have been having for the last 9 months. Now, you can't do that if you're a politician because you get shouted down so aggressively, really, for daring to say those things. But I do see an economic boom on the horizon and a resultant property market boom. I mean, it's problematic this year, isn't it? Because what we're looking at the moment, 5.2% latest ONS for October to October, is too much. You can't justify 5.2% up. That's just silly. Now, if we take the 3% out of the stamp duty holiday and say, well, that explains 3% of it, maybe, because people can pay 3% more. It's not as simple as that. The maths don't quite line up like that. But if we did that for simplicity, we're still seeing a sort of 2.5% move upwards, which doesn't seem to make a lot of logical sense unless you go back to my argument around the wealthier being motivated to move and get to something they really want to. B, people facing their own mortality and thinking, right, I'm going to do it now because otherwise I might never do it. And C, you think of the yield chasers who want to protect any form of return. So if you think back to 2005, I knew a few retired people back then who had, you know, a few 100,000 in the bank, life savings, worked hard all their lives. That was their nest egg. They were earning 5% a year on that in the building society. Inflation was running at about 3%, wasn't it? Something like that.
Yeah.
Happy days, real returns, guaranteed, protected, all the rest of it. Those people at the moment, 0.1, and at the moment, inflation isn't ravaging their money, or I should say the headline rate of inflation isn't. I think we all know it works slightly differently. But next year and the year beyond, you know, the central bank have said, we're going to let inflation do a bit here before we even consider putting rates up, as we were saying earlier. So what does that mean? It means 3% is going to be perfectly palatable for a while. And of course, what does that also do, gentlemen? It inflates the debt away. Oh, how convenient. I mean, what a surprise. So, you know, we know what the game is here, and we know the players in the game and what's got to be done. And look, you couldn't have more clear evidence in the last 10 years of what quantitative easing does to asset prices. You know, you've got a live example, you've got 10 years worth of data. If you want to go and look at Japan, you've got 25 years worth of data. It seems difficult to understand why that trend's not going to continue. And you've got Boris, who wants to make sure all first-time buyers can get stuff with 5% mortgages. And I think you've got a Boris who's got an appetite to let people have 40-year mortgage terms as standard, 45. You know, we've got roadmap in. I remember listening to David's fine presentation about property cycles over 5 years ago now, unbelievably, David, when I first heard it. And it pointed out, you know, the number one driver of house prices is the availability of credit. And quite correctly. And the availability of credit is good. It's solid. And it still looks solid. You know, the banks want this business. They want to lend it. You've got more institutions coming into the market. You've got far more funds. And I mean, look, things change as time goes on. And I suppose I have better quality conversations than I did 5 years ago. You know, no reflection on David, because still conversing with David now. So he's passed the test of time. But the point is,
I'd just pick you up there a second. I must have heard a different talk to you off David, because he said to me the driver of house prices was baked beans.
I don't think you were listening, Andrew, because I think he said this was the price of baked beans in 1984 or whatever. Yeah, very good, very droll, very droll. But you know, there are many more conversations going on with funds, with people who are getting involved with funds, and that's not me sort of ascending through the property ladder. That's just there's more of it going on than there was. You know, so there is more institutional money that want returns. And where are you going to get real returns in a time where you're concerned about inflation? Bricks and mortar, gentlemen, as you know. So can the funds crack the number one problem of trying to asset manage secondary stock versus, you know, some of these very desirable build-to-rent style yuppie blocks, for want of a better word, in city centres, which may not be as popular as they once were, or certainly may not command the same rental premium if you're working from home 40 to 60% of the time. And I don't know the answer to that. I know that we can, and I guess if I can do it, I'm pretty sure someone cleverer than me can do it on a much bigger scale. So, you know, it's doable. So will they decide to take that challenge on? Will they, you know, housing associations have got a fantastic business model. Will we see more money? I mean, some of the bond raises this year in the housing association sector, eye-watering sums at 2% yields. But of course, 2%, when you've got 0% or 0.1, or government selling 10-year longs at minus 0.0007 or whatever, 2% is quite attractive if you've got a pension fund, if you've got obligations to meet. And it's going into the number one safe bricks and mortar asset housing. Yes, gold's gone up. Yes, Bitcoin's gone up. Does anybody want to be on that journey for the long term if you're managing, you know, 23 billion of pension fund assets? You can't. You don't want to be on the, you know, your backside's on the line when the committee have the meeting and say, oh, how's the Bitcoin? Oh, the Bitcoin's down to 8,500. No, it's not ideal, is it, Mr. Lawrence? You know, you're not going to be doing that. You're going to be looking at bonds that can deliver and stuff. And you know, residential property and commercial have still got lots and lots of room for institutional investment in the UK. We're underinvested by bigger funds and things like that. And now there's appetite. I see more of that going on. What it will look like it's a sector that's going to consolidate over years. So it doesn't pertain necessarily to next year, but I see acceleration in that sector.
I see with retail, all the corner shops got squeezed out and disappeared, but the corporate sector, they can't squeeze out these residential things because they're scattered all the way across the country and people live in them. So they're going to have to kind of change their corporate mindset a bit if they're going to embrace that.
That's it. But also, you know, the flip side to that, David, is if you have a conversation with a commercial funder, they strongly dislike concentration of assets geographically. So there's the one side of saying, okay, you can geographically diversify and that adds to the portfolio mix, but it will also add to the operational cost element without a shadow of a doubt. So there are pros and cons to that argument. And I think that conversation will be had more and more as funders start to look more and more closely. Because, you know, 10 years ago, how many property companies could you buy that had 100 properties in them? There wouldn't have been many. They'd have been very, very quiet. You didn't even have companies house beta in those days, did you? So you couldn't even look them up online. Now you can search by SIC code. You can look at balance sheets. I can search on property data for a company, see how many properties they own. It's all in the public domain.
Yeah. Do you see a big demographic shift in terms of who is going to want to live in the cities when people want to start living in them again?
Well, I think who wants to live in the cities anyway? It's generally the young come up through the ranks, don't they? And if I look at the sort of generation since I left university, my generation, a lot went to London. They made money. They bought houses in their mid-20s or flats, realistically, made a bucket load on those flats, have now moved out to the home counties or similar, or moved out of London altogether. The generation, so say a generation is 10 years, generation below me, took them a bit longer, rented till they were 30, even if they had good jobs, early 30s, managed to buy something. Not as good, didn't make as much money on anything, bit flatter. The generation below that, who are 20 at the moment, or 20, let's say leaving university at the moment, before this year, hardly any prospect of even renting in zone 1 or 2, totally unaffordable. Now, there's been a correction there. How permanent will that correction be? When tourism comes back to London, the stock will evaporate again because it will go to short let, of course, as we know a lot of it was doing that. Will there have been a correction? But now, is the desirability there? Would you not rather be in zone 5? Maybe you can get a garden. You can have a garden somewhere, zone 5 or 6. I've only got to do the tube 2 days a week. So not so bad. So there's going to be a shift in that metropolitan area is becoming more sprawling, particularly London. There's bound to be. So what's an acceptable commute 2 days a week versus 5 days a week? Big question. And we'll see that. And, a percentage will be affected by that on a permanent basis. But look, prime will recover, but I think it could be flat for some years. You won't see a lot of people realising prime assets when they've taken a bath. I mean, the thing is, this came at a good time, really, for London, in that the bubble popped in 2016. Now, it's slowly deflated, really, rather than a big pop. There have been receiverships, as there always are, of course, but generally speaking. So we didn't go into 2020 with a roaring London market that needed knocking off its perch. We went in with one that was limping towards Brexit. So there hasn't been that sort of... And, of course, what has transacted this year has been up. But that's more driven by the houses, I think, than the flats. That doesn't tell the whole story. The flats are struggling.
Sort of temporary post-lockdown insanity as well played a part, I think, in that initial surge.
Yeah. To go back to something which you said earlier, Adam, and I'd like to sort of explore this a tiny little bit with you. You said next year, potentially we could be going back to normal when all the population over the age of 65 have been vaccinated. Describe or share with me your vision of what normal is now, because the world is sort of
new normal.
Yeah, there's a new normal, and the world has sort of gone on to Zooms and virtual meetings. What do you see as a new normal?
Well, I think we have to remember, I think something like 90% of the workforce is employed by small companies in the UK. So whatever we hear about Google or Facebook, who notoriously don't employ many people anyway compared to their revenue, is not really reflective of the real world of work. So small businesses want people in places. It's important for team building. It's important for communication. It's important for morale. Even people who I would have thought would love working from home still want to come back to the office. They really want to. So yes, I think maybe 10%, Andrew, will see a permanent change. I think there's now a dichotomous argument to companies thinking, well, actually, do we need that big flashy city centre space anymore? Something more flexible might be nice for us. So there's going to be, things falling out on that front. If we can keep the address and halve the space, jolly good, and share the desks, then jolly good. So I think there'll be a bit of a drive towards that. So I see more, equalising the suburbs of the new cities for the next 5 years, in my opinion. Very accessible for the cities, much cheaper, although I expect the prices to adjust accordingly. And pop up, some of those towns will be vibrant again. And people are going to want, it's a great time whenever, March, April, May, to start a restaurant if you've got passion and you've got funding, because a lot of your competition will have been wiped out.
Yeah, and you don't even need to refurbish one. You can buy a ready-made one. Good to go.
At 50 pence in the pound. Yeah, absolutely, David. So that's bound to be a factor, I think, Andrew. So I think people will want social activities and things like that. I think none of us can avoid how efficient it is to do this rather than three of us getting together. That's hours and hours of our time collectively saved travelling. And yes, we might be able to do some work on the train, or we might be able to do some phone calls in the car. But this is incredibly efficient compared to what we were doing. So that will preserve. And I think there'll be a lot of hybrid style solutions. So thinking of partners in property, I'm pretty sure we'll be streaming our events still, but we'll be streaming them live with the people there. So you can do both. And I think a lot of conference style things and meetings of quality will be doing things like that. I don't see a vast flight to offshoring a lot of this knowledge work, which is really what we do in the UK, because we've got that, and that knowledge isn't just how to run a set of accounts. That knowledge is, how do I transact with people? How do I do deals with people? How do I interact with my colleagues? How do I have a career and a progression? And the soft skills it's much harder over Zoom to get that across. I like to think I have a big, not just because I'm heavy, but I have a big impact when I go into a room. That's what I'm trying to do. It's not so easy on Zoom, is it? I can't leave it out of
the word I'm looking for, Adam, is a presence. You've got a presence.
Thank you, Andrew, for saving me.
Some people, when they enter a room, just have a presence, and that a statesman-like figure has entered the room. Yeah. So we know that when you're there, Adam.
And I think younger people will be desperate to get back to what they want, that urbanised lifestyle, even if they do live a bit further out and save a bit on rent. And if you are, the older heads who are the mentors, who are the, passing your knowledge on, you need to be doing that stuff face to face. It is that's not, tech doesn't change that. Not for me, not until the millennials or the Generation Zers are in their 50s and 60s. Now then I would expect things to look different, and I can understand that. But, this has accelerated a few things, hasn't it? It's accelerated retail businesses that were already in trouble going to the wall. It's accelerated lots of things, it's accelerated the issues in some commercial property covenants. It's accelerated the growth of Amazon and Tesla and all the rest of it, all the tech stocks, because tech has, but it's also brought a few things home, like actually those supermarkets, they were never a bad bet, and maybe they were a bit too cheap, and the multiples, maybe the yield compression might change on your grocery stores, whereas it probably wasn't given as much credence as it should have been. That things have been reset on that front, haven't they?
Yeah. Well, your what I call your Co-op local, Tesco's, Sainsbury's local, or whichever flavour of chain you prefer. The local stores have absolutely had record-busting years. And I think businesses like that now need to look at their supply chain and logistics as to how they service them, because demand has grown, and it's about trying to keep the stock on that shelf, because they haven't got enough shelf space and storage space for it. But Before we sort of wrap up, would you share one last thing with us? What would be your highlights on residential, commercial, and development for the year? You're obviously you're talented in all fields. You've penchant for the residential, but what do you see as the big highlights to look out for next year in residential, commercial, and development?
Okay, well, starting with Resi, I think that the really sharp operators will be looking to pick up stock that's already tenanted. So we're seeing construction costs ever rising, it getting more difficult to do refurbs, higher frictional costs on doing deals, but we're also seeing landlords who want to get rid of stuff, and there's a massive concern that they can't evict, even if they haven't got a problematic tenant, they can't evict. What does that mean? It means opportunity. So getting stuck into stuff that's got tenants in situ that's a legitimate sale, of course, you've got to do your homework on that and caveat emptor always, but there's opportunity there. And I see that as a real highlight for 2020. And I'm going to be doing that myself. I shouldn't really be telling everyone because I'm going to be doing that myself, definitely. Commercial, I think you're going to see a lot of sites that could be repurposed, as you said, Andrew. You know, there's been so many tweaks with planning this year. A lot of that's gone under the radar because there's been bigger fish to fry. Yeah. What about airspace? What about all these things that are now very viable? And what about suburban unloved stuff that, as we were saying, I think could continue this resurgence? Little shops and tops might be quite nice. Whole parades might be available. And for the really the big players, you know, some of these shopping mall style things that need some repurposing and some redesigning and some redevelopment, if you've got the backing, then you could be getting stuck into that and making some serious wonga, I think, Andrew. And in terms of development, I think you're going to see continued decent support for development in terms of availability of funding. And I think you're going to see lots of opportunities where people want to release land because stuff's got stuck in pipelines, you know, shortened the amount of time you've got to land bank. Getting stuff through planning at the moment is a nightmare because it takes too long. And what happens when they get to the end of their period? If it's not PD, tough luck. What do you do? Wait. What do you do next? Wait. What do you do then? You get planning with about 42 conditions attached to it because they couldn't do the work in time. So there's a lot of opportunity on people releasing sites that otherwise are very viable to build out if you can solve those problems, which I guess is, you know, what happens every year really. But I think that's probably my three highlights, Andrew.
No, brilliant. Well, David, is there anything you'd like to pick Adam's brains on before we thank him very much for his incredibly valuable insights into 2021?
Maybe one tiny thing, certainly sort of early in the year in what I call lockdown 1.0, we were discovering all sorts of things. Everybody suddenly Googled in April what exponential growth means, which was quite an interesting one. And then after that, we did a bit of a history lesson and you referred earlier to the Spanish flu. Now, interestingly, looking at post-Spanish flu, it took 3 or 4 years to people getting. I mean, what were they doing back then? They weren't going to the cinema or to the diner. They were going to the pews to pay their homage to the big guy. But, you know, it's 3 or 4 years before they got out to do that. Do you think there'll be a quicker recovery this time? Perhaps?
I do. I think there'll be a much faster recovery, and I'll tell you for why, David. I mean, you know, 1.5% of the world's population died, 60 million people, at a time when the world's population was considerably smaller, really, you know, orders of magnitude smaller than it is today. So I think you've got somewhere between, and it's difficult to say, but looking at different surveys, between 25 and 50% of the population are quite sceptical as we speak right now. It's not going to take a lot to persuade them to get out there again. I think there'll be a lag of 10% of people, certainly who are in their more senior years, who are going to be more concerned, and rightly so, because their risk level is higher. But if they've been vaccinated, again, back to my point around what are the critical levels of vaccine, rather than me thinking, oh, I'm not going to get vaccinated till 2022. I'm not living my life worrying about COVID as it is. I'm worried about what the government are doing to react to COVID, which is much more worrying in itself. So I think it'll be much, much faster than that. If you look at the speed of deterioration in the markets this year, as you referred to earlier, and the speed of response as well, which, of course, we haven't talked a lot about that, but in 2008, 2009, we weren't really that critical about the slow pace of. I mean, what, 6 months after Lehman went for us to put the base rate down? This time it was about 25 seconds, wasn't it? And then we put it down 3 days later, a bit more. You know, so total different speed of response, and that has to mean, even though we're not looking at a V shape, faster down has to mean faster back up naturally. I think it was incredible. I'm one of the few people who thinks, rather than worrying so much about the 25% GDP we lost in April, I think it's phenomenal that 75% of the economy kept going. I think that's a testament to you know, fortitude of people and unwillingness to accept you know, defeat. And I think we'll see more of that next year. And yeah, I think it'll be faster. And that's why I think if the government go too far out, there'll be a rebound and they'll be thinking, hang on a second, why have we got all these people on furlough when everyone's back to work? So I'm quite optimistic about the speed of. I said when we spoke earlier on in the year, David, you know, it'll be a long time, but we're 9 months in now, and we've got a lot better treatment of this stuff. We've got a lot better. There is knowledge on both sides out there. You have to be very careful what you listen to. But we've all done our own risk assessments by now. We all know what we're doing. We all know whether we're following the lockdown rules over Christmas or not. I'd be interested if you do a poll on that, Andrew, to everybody who watches the video. But I think
drop
that tells
those comments below. Are you observing the lockdown or not?
Use a false name if you need to, yeah, especially if you're in a tier 4 area. Yeah.
Well, Adam, it's been an absolute delight. I mean, I've learned things from you today. I've agreed with a lot of what you've said, and a lot of, I think we think very similar anyway, a lot of the time, which is always a sign that either I'm mad and you're mad, or we're both half right. But if you've enjoyed this, obviously give Adam a thumbs up, drop a comment. Do you actually agree with all the things that Adam's been saying? There's been some controversial things there about economic support coming through, more stimulus and through not raising taxation. Or do you think Adam's a fool, continually seeking opportunities and looking to grow that portfolio of his? Or should he be sort of selling up like the mass market? I don't know. Drop a comment, let Adam know what your thoughts are. And if you've not already, watch some of the others. In the 12 property days of Christmas, we have a whole raft of experts sharing very interesting views, all very different, and you will be able to create and formulate your own strategy from those views. So thank you, David Clouter, for joining us. Thank you, Adam Lawrence. It's been a fantastic session, and it's goodbye from me, Andrew Roberts.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Thank you.